You're listening to the Nourish Child Podcast, episode number 72.
Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Oh, grandparents, one of the most joy-filled roles of post-parenthood. Grandparenthood is the time of life when you're not raising a child, you're enjoying a child. From playing, reading, and feeding, and even raising kids, as some grandparents do, today we are exploring the role of grandparents and their influence on their grandchildren, especially in the area of feeding them. To help us understand the influence, frustrations, and dynamic around this unique relationship, I'm talking to Dina Rose, a sociologist and author of the book, It's Not About the Broccoli. You can find today's show notes and relevant links over at jillcastle.com/072. That's 072 for episode number 72. This episode of the Nourish Child Podcast is brought to you by the Nourish Child Project, a program for parents. Do you feel like you somehow missed out on the basic nutrition education you need to successfully nourish your child? I bet you did. Many parents strive to nourish their child well, but find themselves faced with challenges and questions. In the Nourish Child Project, you will get my blueprint for nourishing healthy kids inside and out. Here's actually what you'll get. A food system that includes a balance of all foods, not a restrictive meal plan or diet. A feeding strategy that is proven to be effective and nurturing to children, as well as ways to build healthy habits for now and into the future. Get the Nourish Child Project today by going to www.jillcastle.com/programs. I used to spend the night with my grandmother. She'd pick me up and drive me across town to her house, and I'd plant it there for the weekend. She always had crunchy Cheetos for me, and we'd always make chocolate chip cookies by hand. She always let me eat in front of the TV with a TV tray, and she had a radio in the room I slept in, and I remember listening to Bye Bye Miss American Pie. I loved going to my grandmother's house. As I became a teenager, she'd still come get me, but she'd let me drive her brand new car back to her house. Then she'd have a list of errands to do, and she'd have me do all the driving. You can say I cherished my grandmother. Can you imagine being a grandparent? Some of you are in the thick of raising little kids, so this is probably not something that's even on your radar. But for me, being the mom of older children, some young adults, I can imagine grandparenthood, and I have imagined it. In fact, as my kids get older, and this will probably happen to you too, I've thought about what it will be like to have a house full of little kids again. And if I'm going to be honest, I'm looking forward to it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to wait until the right time. There's no rush here. But I do think about how fun and joyous a time it will be. I want to just get real for a second about some of the statistics around grandparents. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, there were 70 million grandparents in the U.S. in 2014. That's a 24% growth rate since 2001. The census predicts that in 2050, 22% of the population will be grandparents. And they also tell us that 10% of grandparents live with a grandchild. I know in my own practice, the topic of grandparents feeding their grandchildren has come up quite a bit, especially during holidays and summertime visits. Some parents feel stressed out about what and how their kids will eat while spending time with the grandparents. I've brought on Dina Rose today to help us navigate through this tricky topic, and I think you're going to love what she has to say. But I want to tell you a little bit about her first. Dina Rose, PhD, is a nationally recognized sociologist and feeding expert. She is the author of It's Not About the Broccoli, 3 Habits to Teach Your Kids for a Lifetime of Healthy Eating, and the creator of the Superfood Explorer Kit. Dina has been training parents, pediatricians, dietitians, and early childhood educators in the habits approach for the past decade. Her message is pragmatic, memorable, and so unique it has been called transformational. In addition to writing her own blog, It's Not About Nutrition, Dina is also a regular contributor to Psychology Today. Dina's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, NPR, and a wide variety of other outlets. For more information about Dina's work, go to www.itsnotaboutnutrition.com. I'll include links to Dina's blog and her book in the show notes over at jillcastle.com/072. I'm so happy to explore this topic with Dina and have her on the show, so let's not wait any longer. Here's Dina. Hi, Dina. Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast.
Hi, Jill. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I saw your article in, I think it was Psychology Today, about grandparents, and I thought, I have got to have this lady on the show. So I'm so glad you're free and able to do it.
Oh, grandparents. Wow, what a topic, huh?
I know. Well, I know that in my own private practice, it comes up quite a bit, enough to be sort of a pain point for some families. So I wanted to definitely dig into that. But before we get going on that topic, why don't you go ahead and tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I think the thing that really distinguishes me from other people out in the field and really shapes my perspective is that I'm a sociologist. I'm not a nutritionist. And so, as most people know, sociologists spend a lot of time thinking about how parents can shape behaviors and beliefs and values. And that's really what we're doing when we're teaching our kids about eating. And I started my sociological career a bazillion years ago. I was interested in a completely different topic. I was thinking about how incarceration impacted community life. But, right, which leads to a whole bunch of bad jokes about well, if you're studying criminals and now I'm studying kids, aren't they kind of the same? Our little monsters, all sorts of bad jokes like that. But, what happened to me is that my mother, who had a very troubled food life, died while I was pregnant with my daughter, and we'll never really know how much her struggle with obesity influenced, her diseases and caused her early death, but it obviously played some role. And so when my daughter was born, I just became consumed with the question, how do you teach someone to have good eating habits? And, habits are really what sociologists study. So that was right in my ballpark. But I wanted to figure out, how could I make sure that she didn't need to devour that whole bag of chips, or she could just eat a couple cookies instead of the whole sleeve of Oreos, which no one I know does. Okay, maybe I've done that a few times. But anyway, that was really my central question. And so it really changed my life because I stopped working as a sociologist who studied criminology and, really started focusing my efforts on this. And what I really learned is that we have to focus directly on habits, which are the behaviors that translate nutrition into eating. And that if we do that, then the nutrition will come along for the ride. I mean, I wasn't focused on how I was going to get my daughter to eat fruits and vegetables. I was interested in teaching her how to enjoy all sorts of foods and, not to overeat and to pay attention to her stomach. But of course, what happens when you do that is the nutrition comes along for the ride. Mm-hmm. And what I noticed as I was watching other parents, and then of course, as I read the literature and then started interviewing people, et cetera, what I realized is sometimes when we put the nutrition first, we can inadvertently teach our kids the wrong habits. And so we might get into a pattern of feeding them a monotonous diet instead of a varied diet when we really want is to feed them a varied diet because, they like these 3 foods and they have enough nutrients. And there are all sorts of ways that can happen. And so that really focused the work that I did from way back when to now. It's been over a decade, and it's what produced the habits approach philosophy that I talk about so much and produced my book, It's Not About the Broccoli, and here we are.
Yeah, you've added and contributed such valuable information and content to that space. So I know I appreciate it and have enjoyed your perspective on things because it is habits, and that developmentally where children are and what habits they're building. And it's a refreshing approach for parents to be able to sort of take the pressure off of getting food perfectly right, which that message is so strong out there and is difficult for parents to take that in and actually, create that perfect diet for their child because they have a child who has an opinion and who is going to eat this or not eat that. And so that's where the challenge gets into play as well.
And we put so much pressure on parents from our cultural expectations. It's like if they don't get it right, they start to worry that their kids are going to get some terrible disease or die, or they're bad parents, or whatever they think. And they don't really think that consciously, but there's so much pressure to get it 100% right. And one of the things that makes it even more challenging is that we also have this cultural message that kids can't be expected to like healthy food. And so that puts parents between a rock and a hard spot, because if you have to get the right nutrients into your kids in the right amounts, but your kids can't be expected to like those foods, then you're really up against a huge challenge. And then when you add in the fact that we live in an environment where there's just so many tempting foods out there and so much advertising for junk and 1,000 birthday parties with pizza, and it can be really, really tough.
Right. And I think that segues nicely into our topic about grandparents, because what I am seeing, or what I have seen, are parents who are feeling so much pressure to work hard on getting their family to eat a healthy diet. And then they feel like they send their children off to the grandparents' house for the summer visit or for the holidays, and everything goes down the drain. And that causes a lot of stress for parents. And
it does. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's an interesting dynamic. And I think that's what I'd like to explore with you today on the show, because a lot of parents do feel a lot of stress and anxiety and even resentment towards grandparents, particularly if their habits aren't very good themselves, and they're passing those on or influencing the grandchildren in that way. But before I ask you questions about grandparents, I wanted to just ask a personal question. And that is, as a child, did you have grandparents in your life? And what was that like for you?
So my mother's parents died before I was really aware of them. I mean, one died before I was born and one died right after I was born. My father's parents were around, and, one of the signature things about my Nana was her chocolate chip cookies. And and the funny thing is, it was more of a family myth that these were the best chocolate chip cookies on the planet, because they were good, but we all just, I don't know, maybe they came with Nana love or something, because we just thought they were the best. And so whenever we went to see her, that there were those chocolate chip cookies. And then when we were in college, she was sending us chocolate chip cookies. They didn't always arrive in one piece because she didn't really know how to pack them, but everybody would just, go wild for the cookies. And so that is a very warm and fuzzy memory for me, especially because, she was my only grandmother. And I think it really shaped some good memories and some good family feelings.
Yeah, I have the same. My grandmother made chocolate chip cookies also. And when I look back on it, we made them by hand, meaning there was no blender or mixer. It was like hand. And I just remember how hard it was, but I wanted those chocolate chip cookies. And then now my own 4 children, they're so fortunate. My mother-in-law is a fabulous baker. And I do think her chocolate chip cookies are the best I've ever had. And so my kids get, Nana's chocolate chip cookies are always, they're famous in our family. So there are a lot of warm and fuzzy feelings about grandparents. How common do you think it is for grandparents to give their grandchildren treats, or to gravitate towards more of the sweets and the treat foods rather than the healthier foods?
Well, there's not been a tremendous amount of research in this area, but the little bit of research that has been conducted really does show what we all know, which is grandparents are indulgent and they want to be, the good guy, and they are permissive, and they are going to do their best to give their grandkids the treats. And in the Psychology Today piece that I wrote, I started out by saying, watch out for my daughter, because I am getting ready. Not that she should not have a child anytime soon. I'm just saying she's only 17. But I already know that when I am a grandmother, I am going to let myself, enjoy those moments and give my grandchildren all sorts of sweets and treats. And, one of the one of the things that happens is that as parents, when when the grandparents do the treat giving, if we want our kids to have a healthy diet, that means that we as the parents have to actually do less of the treat giving. And so in a way, I understand that one dimension that we don't really think about that much. Of course, it is about the treats, but one of the things that happens for parents is that, we are deprived of the joy of giving our kids ice cream if grandma and grandpa are always giving our kids ice cream. And that is one of the sort of the hidden points of tension, actually.
That's a really insightful observation. Hadn't thought of it that way before.
Yeah, I mean, think about it and that I think is one of the things. Look, I've worked really hard to teach my daughter to have the right eating habits. And of course, she eats ice cream and candy and everything because it's all about putting it into your diet in a way that works, which means as the smallest component of the proverbial pie. But if somebody else is giving her, I've had to be sort of stricter with her. And so by the time the grandkids come along, I'm sure it's just in reaction to that, like teaching this kid to eat healthy isn't going to be my job. My job is just to be the spoiler.
No, and that's so true. And I am so looking forward to grandchildren myself, and I find myself thinking more about it just because the kids are older. My oldest is 21, my youngest is 16, and I can start to envision what life will be like with little kids running around the house. And I can't wait for that because I love young children. And I feel the same way. I'm going to be the indulgent grandmother. We're going to bake. We're going to cook. We're going to eat whatever. And I feed my kids that way anyways. I know with the label dietitian, many people think, oh my gosh, Jill would never give her kids treats and sweets. Well, my kid, I have it all the time. We have it in the house. My kids don't have issues with it because they have, they know how to eat and indulge and enjoy and walk away when they're done and leave things on their plate. I mean, that's the habits that they've learned and the balance that we've struck here. But what's interesting to me is that, yeah, in fact, it makes parents have to step into their job a little bit more firmly if the grandparents are more indulgent.
Yep. And I have a particularly strong view about this because my daughter does not have any living grandparents. So she's never had anybody do that extra spoiling, except for one time, which is just an incredible moment when my daughter was about 5. We were visiting a very good friend of my mother's, and we walked into her house. It had been raining outside, and we walked into the house. We were soaking wet. And this woman just scooped up my daughter and said, "Oh, you're soaking wet. We must get you some hot chocolate." And my daughter, of course, lit up. And then she said, "And I think I have a box of chocolates in the cupboard." And then my daughter looked at me like, "Can I?" And then this woman looked at my daughter and said, "Oh, don't look at her. You're in my house right now." And my daughter looked at me with such satisfaction, like someone trumped mom, someone was going to. And I think that most people hearing that story would think that there was a part of me that was thinking hot chocolate plus chocolates plus whatever else was coming. Oh no. But really what I was thinking was, oh, thank goodness she's getting a moment of that grandmother spoiling, time so that she can have that kind of a memory. And so I like to remind parents that this is really also about building memories. And so let's not get hung up on the food. Of course, we want to teach our kids to have a healthy relationship with food. And we can actually use the indulgent grandparents as a mechanism for doing some teaching around this. But first and foremost, the memories matter. The relationship matters. And so if we can keep that in mind, it kind of takes the sting out a little bit.
Absolutely. And, I always also observe that or talk with my clients about the fact that, it's one day, it's one event, it's easy to reboot, restructure, get back on whatever, when you get home, your plan, whatever your mantra, your approach to eating is when you get home. But to allow children to have a unique relationship with their grandparents, I think is very important too. And oftentimes it does have to do with food.
Yes. The problem with it's a one-off that parents experience, of course, is that so many times in our life, it doesn't feel like a one-off because today we might be at our grandparents' house, but then tomorrow there might be a party. And then the next day there might be a play date with somebody who gives out lots of cookies. And so each of these events feels like they are happening on top of each other. So it can be tricky to figure out how to do that reboot or how to do that reset.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there's anything that, around the idea that parents are feeling other issues around the grandparent being indulgent with the grandchild, or, is there any stuff that comes up that you see around, oh, my parents don't eat healthy, so I don't want them to transfer that to my children, or, oh, they're not being a good role model, I don't want my child to have that as a role model. Is there any of that stuff or any childhood stuff that comes up, you think, for parents around this issue?
Well, absolutely. And especially if the parents or the in-laws, like that can be even trickier, right? Don't have the best eating habits in general, we can worry that they're going to pass that on to the kids. But here's the thing that I like to remind parents is this, that we have to talk to our children, no matter what their age, in order for them to learn the right lessons. And so we would never throw the grandparents under the bus and say, grandma has, terrible eating habits. Don't go over there or don't listen to grandma. But we can make this a very positive experience and say like, oh, we're going to grandma's house. You know how yummy her chocolate chip cookies are, and we're going to have tons of them there. So how are we going to handle this? Like, even if they're 3 years old, we can still say, so we don't want to have too much in our week. So let's think of things we could do. And then we can start supplying brainstorming solutions, like have a day before we go to grandma's where we're not going to have any sweets and treats, and a day after we go to grandma's where we're not going to have any sweets or treats. And when we do that, we're teaching them such an important lesson that's much more important than the fact that they might overeat on that one day. And when we talk to our children about the lessons that we want them to learn, we are actually taking the power out of what we think of as the bad example, if that bad example exists.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Teaching them what we want them to learn.
Yeah, we have to talk to them. We can't assume that they're going to learn the lessons just by being in the environment. And it's not about controlling that food. So let's imagine the scenario that I was talking about before, where we're going to grandma's one day, but the next day there's a birthday party, and the next day there's a play date. We can actually talk to our kids and say like, well, here's the problem. There's going to be this day and then this day and then this day. So what can we do? And a perfectly reasonable solution to that would be to make sure that we really make the meals before and after those days, those days would be better. But then the meals on those days, we can, enhance them and make them healthier than we might ordinarily do. And then we can really talk to kids about how to make choices during that day. So, it's not unreasonable for a young kid to make a choice that they'll go to the birthday party after the day after they see grandma, and they're going to have the cake, but they won't have any candy because they'll take the candy and bring it home. It's not that you have to forego it. It's just that you have to delay it. So I'm not suggesting that that automatically be the solution. What I am suggesting is that when we ask our children to participate in making the decisions, we are no longer controlling the food, which is a bad dynamic, but we are teaching them a very valuable lesson about how to deal with the food world that they're going to live in for the rest of their lives. And that's the key.
Yeah, navigating those tricky situations. Absolutely. I like that advice. And I give that also to my clients as well, because it is, it's not about control, because actually our goal is to build autonomy in our children, especially around food choice and eating patterns and habits. And we teach them, and those tricky situations or those scenarios that you describe are great opportunities to teach these lessons.
It is. I mean, it's painful because we don't want to have to deal with it, or because it's not in our control. Our kids go to these places, they go to grandma's house, they go to parties, etc., and it's outside of our control. So it can be very frightening and sort of puts us on shaky ground. But that's why we have to empower our children with the knowledge and the skills to make the right choices. That doesn't mean we want our kids to sit there and go, oh man, I really want that, but I can't have it. Mom told me, that's not it. And if they slip up, it's no big deal, because they're going to slip up. It's like when children learn how to read, they don't read perfectly, but we don't freak out when they misspell something or misread something. These things will all work themselves out in the long run. And that's really the thing that parents can do to help themselves get through these moments, is to take a step back and realize two things. One, big picture. Two, learning process.
Mm-hmm, definitely. One of the things that I think for some parents is particularly stressful in this type of situation, be it a party or be it a grandparent's house with lots of sweets and treats, is if their child is heavier. Whether their perception that their child is out of control when they're around those types of foods, or their child is in fact carrying extra weight. That makes it even trickier for them. So what advice would you have to those parents? Would it change from what you've just described?
Not really, although I would add on to it, which is to say this, is that when children are heavier, the research shows that parents are more inclined to comment to them about what they're eating and what their weight is, and things like that can make the dynamic more difficult. The most important thing when children have a weight issue is to recognize that they are struggling with an issue that may actually follow them through their lives. And so this is an important area to help them learn some skills. And like if they were having trouble with a reading disability or something, we would be giving them skills thinking about that. And what we want to make sure with kids in this situation, and with all kids, but particularly in this situation, is that we don't create a situation where they are hiding, sneaking, hoarding, doing stuff behind our backs, because not only is that an indication that they're feeling a great deal of shame, and that's just not good in general, but we also want to make sure that they can be honest with themselves about what they're eating and what their motivations are, so that ultimately, over time, they can learn to have a healthier relationship with sweets and treats and food in general. So one of the things that I would tell parents, all parents, let's say they're going to grandma's house, one of the conversations that would be worthwhile to have is to say, these are the kinds of treats that are likely to be there. Which ones do you really love? Let's focus on eating those, and let's pass up the ones that are not our favorite, right? That's what I tell parents to do at Halloween too. Like, eat the candy you love and pass up the ones that you just happen to have. But for kids who might be feeling what I call dessert insecure, where they feel like they're not going to get access to it at home, or they don't get as much as they want, then the kinds of techniques that parents need to consider are things like taking treats home. Like, you don't have to eat this now. We're going to take it home and put your name on it, and you can have it tomorrow. Things like that. And then, of course, away from the table, at some point, we need to have a conversation about different motivations for eating and emotional eating, and eating because something looks yummy, and how to reconnect with your own internal feelings of hunger and fullness. But the time to do that is not when they're at grandma's house, and not to go in and say, you can only have one, and help those kids who already feel like they don't really fit in.
Or deprived even, just
or deprived, right? And are worried maybe other kids are teasing them or whatever, to help them feel good about themselves, because it's only through feeling good about themselves that they're going to be able to eventually learn to eat right.
So I couldn't agree with you more in terms of, providing these children with reassurance that they can have what they want and that they won't be deprived. What I also agree very much with you on is this idea of communication and having these conversations. But what I see in reality is that parents really, really struggle with having conversations around these topics, not only because perhaps they feel uncomfortable having the conversation, but there's a fear of damaging their child in the process of having these conversations. But there's also great hesitation and reservation around what exactly to say.
About the food, about the weight.
Yeah, about the food, about the weight, about, just having these conversations about any kind of topic related to choosing food, their body, I just see a lot of hesitation from parents. And I find that I encourage these conversations too and do a lot of role playing around what they can say and how they can say it and the tone and the manner. But I'm just curious, do you see that hesitation also?
I do, but one of the things I'd like to say is, I'm always reminded of a woman who I worked with many, many years ago. And one of the things that I encouraged her to do with her daughter away from the table, maybe when it's you're getting ready for bed, or some kind of like a safe time when there's a lot of trust already, and to introduce the idea of what we called eye hunger, looking at something and really wanting to eat it. And she had that conversation with her daughter, who was about 7, and her daughter like almost started crying with relief. And she said that she thought she was the only person who felt that way. And so I just think that it's important to find a place for kids to verbalize and express their feelings around food and about desire. And the last thing we want to do is to teach them to lie and say that, not lie maliciously, but to misrepresent themselves as being hungry. Because when parents spend a lot of time saying, well, are you hungry? Because we know you're supposed to only eat when you're hungry. Of course, if you've ever eaten when you're not hungry, raise your hand. And I think that's everybody, right?
Me.
But as parents, we say to kids all the time, well, but are you hungry? So kids know that the only legal way to eat something is to say that they're hungry. And one time, here's a perfect example. I was at a family function and it was a birthday party, and at lunch, the child was full and she stopped eating. She said, I'm full. But then later when the chocolate cake came out, she said, oh my gosh, chocolate cake, I'm so hungry. And I don't really care when kids are going to lie to us. It's just that through that lying, they lie to themselves. And ultimately, they end up thinking that they are hungry when they're not. And one of the interesting pieces of research shows that when kids eat when they're emotionally upset and think that they're hungry, like because they're using that language, ultimately they learn that the feeling of, let's say, sadness is the feeling of hunger. So it's not like they go, oh, I'm sad, I want to eat. They go, oh, I'm feeling that feeling again. That is the hunger feeling. Now I'm going to go eat. And so then learning no, that's sad. Hunger is a different feeling is even more challenging. So we want to stay away from the, well, are you hungry? Because that teaches kids to misrepresent that.
Right. I could do a whole show about hunger and
Yes.
you call it eye hunger, I call it head hunger versus tummy hunger, just different pieces of language to help children understand the difference between what is true hunger and what is not. But it's very interesting how, the language of am I hungry or are you hungry is tossed around so commonly during the day in feeding children. And yeah, I think you're right. It gets misrepresented, overused, misinterpreted. But that aside, I
Right.
want to
That's a
just
whole other
no.
that's a whole other conversation. I was just going to jump in with some other thoughts. I thought, no, let's just skip that. I do want to say one thing getting back to grandparents is that
Yes.
when grandparents are regular caregivers, that's a whole different situation than when your kids are going to see them on the one off or even spend the whole summer with them. Sometimes, grandparents are taking care of the kids 4 days a week or something. So those are situations that are even trickier if the grandparents want to be permissive. And that happens all the time. So in those situations, I think that parents and grandparents end up feeling bad about each other. And that's a sticky situation, right? Because parents feel in debt to the grandparents who are helping them out by taking care of the kids, but the grandparents want to be the grandparents and then they feel guilty that or resentful that they're being asked to feed the kids in a way that they don't want to. So I think that the thing here for parents to do is to remember a couple of things. One is when you're talking about habits, proportion, which is, eating the healthiest food most of the time, is the most important habit in this regard. And, a lot of people call it in moderation or in balance or something like that. And the reason I pull out the word proportion is because moderation can mean so many things and it really can be a stand-in for variety or portion size or whatever. But proportion is really about ratios. And so the benefit of talking about ratios or proportion compared to whether the food is healthy or not is because proportion makes automatic room in the diet for all foods. And so nothing gets demonized. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to help grandparents understand that they have to combine feeding as grandparents and feeding as primary caregivers. And so maybe allocating Fridays or, Tuesday evenings or whatever day, it doesn't matter, as grandparent feeding days gives grandparents the pleasure of being permissive and then gives them a way to sort of compartmentalize that and then hopefully feed kids the more healthful way that you, the parents, are hoping that they'll do during regular days.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I think that's a nice balance. And then how would you advise parents handle just the occasional visit with the grandparents? Just don't sweat it?
I say don't sweat it. I think what we want to do is prepare the kids so that they are, eating well before and after, because that's proportion. I want to help them understand that they should, focus on the treats they really love and pass up the treats that they don't really love. And then the other thing, and people always laugh when I say this, but I always use this. I tell people all the time, and I use this with my daughter, which is just don't throw up. And
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like a stupid thing to say, right? But in a way, it's like a funny way of reminding them, pay attention to your own tummy. So you don't eat too much, don't give yourself a stomach ache, don't overeat. You're in charge. When you say to a kid, don't throw up, you're saying, I'm giving you permission to eat as much as you want, but I'm also holding you responsible for paying attention to yourself. And then, of course, combined with the other tips that we just talked about, kids have the tools to get through that day. And then when they come home, maybe not right away, but at some point have a conversation about what they ate, encourage them to be honest. There are no repercussions, but then we're balancing it out with a day of, good and clean eating, which is what they sort of agreed to before they went. So it's not just hands off, don't sweat it. It's don't sweat it because you're using this to teach your kids valuable skills that they'll need for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm. I like that. The door swings the other way, and I get emails from grandparents who are very concerned about the way their children are feeding their grandchildren. So should parents obviously the ideal is parents and grandparents are aligned in feeding, right? That's the ideal. But should parents and grandparents be sort of talking this out together? I know we're suggesting that, and I agree with your suggestions to, be teaching the child because as a parent, that's that role. But should the parents and grandparents be hashing some of this out together? And if so, or if not, what does that look like?
Well, first of all, if you're the grandparents and your kids are not feeding their children the way you want them to, that's tough.
Yeah.
That's not your department anymore. And so just like if the parents are teaching the kids, I don't know, to dress in a way that we don't like, tough. That's not your department anymore. So from that perspective, no, there should not be any conversation. From the other side, it's really a question of whether the grandparents are regular feeders, regular caregivers of the grandchildren. If they are, then yes, they have to have a conversation. If they're not, then I don't think that necessarily there's any reason to have a conversation. I think that parents need to appreciate the grandparents for the love and the experience and the bonding and the memories and everything that they're doing, and just work with their children about coping and learning how to make decisions and not stressing when it's not done perfectly.
And for the parent who's feeling a great deal of resentment towards the grandparents, who is, the grandparents are not regular feeders, but the parents are really dreading the visits or really seeing this as a situation. Is that a parent issue that needs to be dealt with, internally, or what would you say to that scenario?
I would think so, because the food is really the least important part of that kind of a relationship. So if we want our kids to have good relationships with their grandparents, we have to kind of back off and let that relationship happen. If there are other ways in which we have concerns about how the grandparents are treating the children, then that can become much more serious. And there are certainly situations where parents want to intervene and or supervise or not let the grandparents have that kind of discretionary control and interaction with the grandkids. But if there are no other kinds of issues and it's just about the food, then we have to take a broader step back. And when parents are holding that resentment, I think they need to figure out why they are. So sometimes I know parents who've said to me, but my mom never fed me that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's an issue, but that's not something that you need to talk to your mom about in the context of grandparenting. Maybe that's a side conversation. And if it's because my parents or my in-laws are not respecting how I want to feed my child, then I think that we have to step back and say, why is it so important to you that your children don't have that extra sweet or even those 5 extra sweets if it's just the one day? As long as we're not talking about an allergy issue or some other kind of medical issue, parents can get overly focused on the nutrition and really kind of worry too much. And so they have to figure out how to let go a little bit and see the world through their kids' eyes, see the delight in their kids' eyes, and that should help. But it's definitely tricky.
Yeah. Great advice, Dina. Thank you so much for talking about this topic with me and the audience. I think they're going to get a lot out of this. You had some really terrific points and reframing how to look at the whole situation, which I think will be very helpful for families out there. How can my listeners connect with you after this show?
So my blog is called itsnotaboutnutrition.com. There are hundreds of articles I've written over the years. There are a lot of free downloadable resources. I have a Superfood Explorer kit, which helps children learn how to become adventurous eaters. I do free 30-minute consultations. So go to my website, It's Not About Nutrition. And also, almost everything we've talked about is in my book, It's Not About the Broccoli, 3 Habits to Teach Your Kids for a Lifetime of Healthy Eating. And that book is available everywhere books are sold.
Awesome. Dina, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Jill. Thanks a lot.
So I really hope this episode was helpful to you. Dina had such a lot of practical, good tips and insight to share about this topic. I especially liked what she said about how to handle just the one-time visit or the occasional visit with the grandparents versus how you can handle a grandparent or the situation of a grandparent taking regular care of your grandchild. If you've been struggling with the Grandparent Food and Feeding Challenge, let me know your thoughts about this episode over at jillcastle.com/072, or go ahead and post your comments on my Facebook page, The Nourished Child. If you want to help me grow this show, the best and most helpful way you can do so is to subscribe to the Nourished Child podcast on iTunes or Android. That's it. Just go to the podcast app on your iPhone, click the search icon button, and type in The Nourished Child. Click on the icon. It's a cute little icon of children. And then click on the subscribe button to the right. It's super duper simple. For Android, you can find The Nourished Child on Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, Google Play Music, and other apps. Last, I have a library of useful programs and guides to help you raise a nourished child, and they are all on my website over at jillcastle.com. Head over to find online learning programs, ebooks and guides, podcast episodes, free articles, and free printables, all geared to help you nourish and nurture your child inside and out. As always, I'm super happy you joined me today. I know you're helping your child just by listening. Be sure to give that child and his or her grandparent in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.
This podcast is a proud member of Parents on Demand, a network of high-quality shows for families just like yours. Download our free network app on Apple and Android and listen to your favorite episodes on the go.